Well, of course, we've been watching Alaska very closely just because of that. If it worked in Alaska, of course, it would be a positive for us. If it fell flat on its face in Alaska, it would hurt us.
Doug Goodman there of Nevadans for Election Reform from our 2022 Purple Principle interview. Nevada was the next state after Alaska to pass a citizen ballot measure for the final 4 voting reforms that have ramped up to half a dozen states in 2024.
But Rob, we're very involved in Alaska. The Alaska election model is what we are most excited about. As you know, it has 2 parts, right? You got to get rid of partisan primaries, and then we have to move away from plurality voting.
Eric Bronner from an interview earlier this season on the Purple Principle. Eric is co-founder of Veterans for All Voters, a nonpartisan network of vets working to advance reforms like Final 4 voting, inspired by that initial 2020 Alaska ballot measure and 2022 election.
Alaska, though much, much bigger than DC, has we have similarities in that there's a large indigenous native population in Alaska that isn't necessarily always represented.
Lisa Rice, official proposer of Washington, D.C. Ballot Initiative 83 from our recent episode, also citing there the Alaska model as inspiration in her team's efforts to open primaries and instill ranked choice voting in the deeply blue one-party town of D.C. If you've been listening to some of our shows this season, you're already in the know that numerous states around the nation are seeking to emulate the Alaska election model through 2024 ballot initiatives. Nevada's already halfway there, having passed the first of 2 hurdles required by their state constitution, and there are now efforts underway in Idaho, Colorado, Oregon, Montana, Arizona with some variations, as well as Washington, D.C., all of which we'll be covering this season. Of course, these efforts do vary. Some emphasize opening primaries, others emphasize ranked choice or instant runoff general elections. That depends on the state constitution, current voting system, and of course, voter appetite for change. But all have drawn from Catherine Gale's blueprint in her book, The Politics Industry, and some inspiration from the Alaska election of 2022, where some candidates failed to adjust to this new election system.
Primary wasn't a verb anymore in Alaska. You can't primary anyone. That attack doesn't exist. It was all gone, and no one even knew it was gone.
I'm Robert Pease, and this is The Purple Principle, a podcast on the perils of polarization and the promise of depolarization through election reform. For this July 4th special, we're revisiting previous audio visits from seasons 1 to 4 to our nation's most purple and indy-minded state, and where alliances in the state legislature frequently cross party lines. Let's go back then to our very first Alaska episode, as voters were just beginning to consider that 2020 ballot measure to do away with polarizing party primaries and plurality elections. That episode began with an intro by producer Emily Crissetti and myself, emphasizing some distinctly Alaskan qualities.
Alaska is a different kind of state in many ways. It's dependent on ferry transportation, prop planes, and all kinds of snow machines.
The economy is more diversified than you might expect, but based largely on mining, fishing, farming, and tourism over a 5-month season when days get quite long. But also the oil industry. In fact, since 1982, every Alaskan gets an annual check from a fund financed by oil revenues.
And its size is different, even on a different scale. You could easily fit the next 2 largest states, Texas and California, inside of Alaska, and you would still have room for Nevada and New York.
But at 730,000, the population of Alaska is about the same as the city of Denver, and that's just the city, not the metro area, or of El Paso, Texas.
Alaska is different politically too, and the most independent or nonpartisan electorate out of all 50 states. Nearly 57% of Alaskans do not register for one of the 2 major parties.
Which might explain why Alaska was the most recent state to have an independent governor, Bill Walker.
We talk about the bipartisanship, having a bipartisan administration. We'll have a no-partisan administration. Our administration is going to look like Alaska in every way possible.
And yes, it's also cold in Alaska, as you might have heard. The average midwinter temperature in Fairbanks, a city in the interior, is a bone-chilling negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's tough for many sports, but perfect for the official state sport of competitive sled dog racing, more commonly called dog mushing.
There you go. Good job. It's all right. Welcome to Iditarod. Good job.
But what makes Alaska so intriguing this year is that non-partisanship is on the ballot. Alaska Ballot Measure 2 is one of the nation's most ambitious attempts at electoral reform in decades. It calls for the opening up of party primaries, ranked choice voting, and campaign finance transparency in a single ballot initiative.
We can't make this ballot measure about a certain party. We can't make this about a certain politician, because it's simply not.
That's our featured guest today, Shea Siegert, campaign manager of Alaskans for Better Elections.
I guess the best place to start would be in 2019 when the initiative started up. I was pretty skeptical of the ballot initiative at that point, but like I said, I was at Thanksgiving, and anytime you leave my family Thanksgiving for a phone call, you best be ready to explain what that phone call was about. And so I came back in and had to explain this thing, and actually found out that my dad was a huge supporter of policies like this. And I grew up in a pretty big Catholic family, but politically very, very moderate, and kind of always gave like the two sides to the issue for education's sake. And so I explained it to him, and he started actually selling me on the ballot initiative and saying like, this is a great thing. Like I don't know much about it, but this sounds great.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, obviously Alaska has this rich history of being politically independent, but what does that mean in terms of this ballot measure?
Yeah, so the late Senator Stevens has this amazing, amazing quote that says, "To hell with politics." And you hear that a lot. You saw Governor Walker in 2014 run on Alaska First. When you're the head of a construction crew, you're not going to ask your best worker what party they are before you put them to work. When you are out in the wilderness and you are running into trouble and need to call in a helicopter to come get you out of there, you're not going to ask the pilot what party he is.
That's very true, and there's obviously a lot going on at the national level. You're certainly quite a distance away from Washington, D.C., but does it feel like you're a little closer to Washington during a presidential election year when a Supreme Court justice dies, or do you feel Alaskans put that aside and can just focus on their ballot measure?
I think they focus on it more with everything that's going on in Washington. I was having a conversation with my mother who lives in Boise, Idaho, the other day, and she said, every time I look at the news, I think about your ballot measure, and it just makes more and more sense. And what we're seeing in Alaska, and when Alaskans look at the news, we're very dedicated to keeping Alaska being a state where we take care of each other. If someone's, broken down on the side of the road, then someone's going to stop and ask them if they can change their tire for them or help in any way. It's not a state where you drive by, and it's not a state where you get out of your car and then ask them, hey, what party are you? And if they say what you want, then you help them out. That's not how it is in Alaska. And so I would say that, in terms of proximity to Washington, D.C., I would say we're a safe distance away.
That was Shea Siegert, campaign manager of Alaskans for Better Elections.
Alaska is different, our least partisan state. But is it nonpartisan enough to pass this ambitious electoral reform?
Some highlights there from our first Alaska episode back in 2020, ending with the question whether that first ballot measure with an open unified primary plus ranked choice voting would resonate with voters hearing about these reforms for the very first time. After all, change is hard in everyday life. It's way harder still in politics. But we now know ballot measure 2 did pass in Alaska back in 2020, and we know that a first-in-the-nation election under the Final Four voting system was held there in 2022. Let's go back then to our second Alaska episode during that first Final Four campaign season in 22, and a discussion with independent Representative Calvin Schrage of Anchorage, running at that time for re-election to the Alaska House. We asked him about the impact of an election system where candidates can no longer simply play to their party's most partisan primary voters.
It's hard to extrapolate out what the long-term impact is going to be. We've had hiccups. I think we've also had some already positive results from it. I think speaking of hiccups, I think there's some confusion. I think that, I know that we have candidates out there saying, just rank one, don't rank the other candidates, which if you look at ranked choice voting, you know that that's a bad strategy that actually disadvantages your own voters and their ability to influence the outcome of the election. I think there are some gains, though. I mean, we're about to have a primary. I can tell you for a fact today that in just about every one of the races, we're not going to see good centrist candidates knocked out in a hyper-partisan primary because we did pass this voter initiative 2 years ago. Frankly, I think this is probably the way forward. I mean, I look at the primary results that are just starting to come out from this year's primaries in the lower 48, and you see the exact same problems we've been talking about with primaries. These hyper-partisan folks who run to the extreme to get the votes of a very small minority of voters to then have the rest of the voters have to choose from two extreme candidates on the general election ballot, of which neither really represents the majority of voters. That's a problem.
Alaska State Legislator Calvin Schrage, an independent representing Anchorage in our fall 2022 interview during the nation's first Final Four voting election. That produced split-ticket results, including re-election of the conservative governor, Mike Dunleavy, a moderate Republican U.S. Senator in Lisa Murkowski, and a centrist Democratic U.S. House member in Mary Peltola. Yet despite these split-ticket results, Final Four voting in Alaska now faces a repeal effort from the right through a potential ballot initiative. Catherine Gale, architect of Final Four and Final Five voting, she's long argued there's too much attention on all sides to who gets elected in our country, not enough to how they govern once elected. And there is now one interesting data point on this question. In our interview earlier this season, we asked Catherine about the culture and the output of an Alaska state legislature elected via Final Four voting, first in the nation in 2022, now facing re-election through that same method. In other words, there may never have been a legislative session in U.S. history so well insulated from our polarizing election system.
The news from the people in Alaska's legislature whom I talk to is really good, which is that they say that this election system, Final Four elections, has changed what they do in their jobs and has changed what their colleagues do. At the beginning of their session, when they formed this bipartisan majority coalition, they were able to agree on 3 top priorities, and they've been successful at moving those through the legislature. They have bipartisan leadership, they share the leadership control. They certainly had the exact opposite experience of what the U.S. House had when they were choosing leadership of their chamber.
So there is a repeal effort in Alaska. It's an unpredictable state. If it is, for some reason, successful, the repeal, but other states, Nevada, Idaho, other states, have success this year, on balance, how do you come out in that scenario?
Any setback is a setback. Having said that, if it were to be repealed in Alaska, if the repeal was successful, but we still won in other states, then the experiment of Final Four and Final Five voting lives on, and it is ultimately the results of the experiment in governing that is going to determine whether we expand or not. So as long as there are states active in the experiment, we'll be able to keep going, even if Alaska would be repealed. It would be sad and devastating and not helpful for Alaskans. I wouldn't be surprised if they came back again and changed it. That's the way change happens sometimes in democracies.
Catherine Gale, architect of Final Four voting. As noted, that very first Final Four Alaska election in 2022 re-elected the pragmatic Democrat Mary Peltola to the U.S. House on the third ballot. So we kicked off our Purple Principle Season 4 in conversation with Representative Peltola on the unique nature of her state, the experience of running in Final Four elections, and how election reform could change the zero-sum nature of our politics and our governance.
Well, Alaska is unique because we really rely on each other for just day-to-day survival. And we have such a few number of people in such a vast geographic state. I think people in the lower 48 can't fathom the distances. So I am from the community of Bethel. We're about 75 miles off the Bering Sea. Our nearest town that's bigger than Bethel is 400 miles away. You can only get there through Alaska Airlines on a 737, and our commodities are all either freighted in by cargo plane or barges. We have 56 villages in the region that I'm from. My region is the size of Oregon. The region that I'm originally from, we have 56 villages, none of which are connected by road. And then in the larger state of Alaska, we really have 6 states within a state. We're 3 Californias or more than 2 Texases. We're just a really huge, dangerous state, and we all need each other. And being entrenched in partisan thinking just doesn't serve us.
You were elected to the state legislature at a very young age, if we have this correct, age 24. So you had several elections without Final Four voting, and then, of course, elections with Final Four voting. Did you feel that that was a different environment, that that was a markedly less strictly zero-sum partisan situation when you ran under Final Four voting?
Yes, and another difference between when I ran in the 1990s and 2000s, it was just a very different era. I mean, at that time, you only had comments at the end of news articles. We didn't have social media. Things just weren't as partisan. And this history and model of working together across the aisle was just very pervasive in Alaska, and I think in many other places. But it is very different. I know that I would not be in this position if we didn't have the Final Four system, because I would not have made it through a partisan primary. I am not liberal enough to have been elected by Democrats. My views on predator control, my views on Alaska's need for resource development is just not in keeping with the more liberal folks in our party. So I think that with the Final Four system, you tend to get people who are not establishment, they are not entrenched in their parties, and they're able to appeal to a broader group. The other good thing about Final Four is it really tones down the personal attacks, it tones down the partisan attacks, because you're also working to get second and third place votes.
From our point of view, having covered polarization for 3 years now, we feel like Alaska is out ahead. Alaska did something other states are now trying to emulate. Do you find that your constituents understand that a lot of people have watched what they've done there, and is that a point of pride?
I don't know. We're so Alaska is so isolated, and it is such an effort and expense to come to the lower 48. And many of us have very close ties and family ties with folks in the lower 48. But we just really are kind of our own place, our own country. We kind of are a lot like Texas, where we're kind of like a nation state in our own mind. But I am very prideful of the way that we work together session after session. Like I mentioned earlier, the state house district that I represented was very rural and remote. And I was the chair for the Bush caucus. We refer to our most remote places in Alaska as the Bush. And there were 10 of us, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. And our coalition, we were very productive. We were able to get a lot of capital programs, capital projects, a lot of good programs that benefited people throughout the state, education funding. But because we had that bipartisan group of 10 out of 40, we were very successful.
So, Mary, from your time in Alaska, let's say when you first joined the legislature there, was there anything that helped you like bridge the political divide?
Yes. So when I was first elected, I was in my mid-20s, and I imagined, like most people do, that I was going to, to fight against our enemies and fight for my district. And when I got there, one of my colleagues told me, and this was advice he had received from his dad, who had been in the legislature, you have to have 59 best friends if you want to accomplish anything. So I really internalized that and made it my mission to become friends with all of the members, regardless of their background. And there was one member in particular, we were total opposites on everything. We didn't align on a single issue, but we, in the Juneau legislature, in the Alaska legislature, there's a members only lounge for eating. And that's where we were really able to get to know other members. And so this member that I didn't agree with on anything, we realized we both love cucumber salad. So that was our bond, is, this German salad. But really, there's such a primal thing about eating with people, eating together, breaking bread. And the other thing is, I realize so many of these issues are long game. And in this House, we have 2-year election cycles, and it's hard to have a long-range vision or long-range goals if every year you're basically running for re-election. But I'm very hopeful that we will become more bipartisan and find ways that we can work as Americans together. We're all on the same team. We all want the same things for our country.
Well, that's great. If you run on the cucumber party ticket, you have our vote, Mary.
The cucumber salad, yes.
You've been listening to our Independence Day bonus special featuring highlights from our first 3 episodes on the most indy-minded state in the nation, the frontier state of Alaska. We'll be visiting there later this summer to check in on the Alaska model as it gears up for a second election under Final Four voting, which may include a repeal measure brought by far-right groups even as the Final Four model is taken up by numerous other states, deep red, deep blue, and varying degrees of purple. Next up, though, we're talking with 2 directors of the group South Dakota Open Primaries, Joe Kirby and Dean Knudsen. They've opted for a simpler ballot initiative to remedy low voter turnout and legislative output in this GOP-dominated state.
Like I said in the New York Times, I want our election system to produce elected officials who reflect South Dakota values, not the values of the 17% that show up to vote in primaries. There's a big difference between those 2 groups. Regular South Dakotans have values that are more in sync with traditional Republican values.
Admitting people who want to run for office in South Dakota who would be just excellent legislators, because the system is structured as it is, they realize that they can't get through a primary. They can't get through a Republican primary.
We hope you'll join us for this discussion with additional commentary from John Updike, founder and president of the national group Open Primaries. For nearly 2 decades, John has helped foster efforts around the country to create voting access to taxpayer-funded primary elections to all American taxpayers. Wasn't some tea spilled about this? Purple Principle is created by a talented team of audio reformers: Kevin A. Klein, senior audio engineer; Vienna Maglio, bookings and field producer; Trevor Profit, digital ops and strategy; Mary Claire Cogler, video production; and Jason Tomczak, fact-checking and research. Purple Principle is a Fluent Knowledge production. Original music by Ryan Adair Rooney.